7 Stoic rules Marcus never broke. The day Marcus almost gave up. How Marcus faced the plague. Greatness never screams when it suffers. It bleeds in silence, it burns in stillness, and it reigns without ever needing applause. You were never meant to have it easy. Not with the weight of an empire pressing into your chest. Not with the ghosts of generals, traitors, and dying citizens whispering through the marble halls at night. You weren't born to escape hardship. You were forged by it. Your throne was not a seat of luxury, Marcus. It was a crucible, a test, a torment disguised as duty. And every morning you rose to meet it, not because you wanted to, but because you had to. Because what you believed in was bigger than your fear. But there was one morning, darker than the rest, when even you, the philosopher-king, almost couldn't go on. The wind didn't howl that day. It whispered, mocked you. The torches in the Senate flickered like they, too, were about to give up. Rome was infected, not just by the Antonine Plague, but by fear, decay, betrayal. And you were cracking. You thought no one saw, but your soul was trembling. You were tired of the funerals, of the silence after every plea, of writing meditations in the dark, trying to remind yourself that virtue still mattered in a world that had forgotten how to kneel before it. You wrote to yourself not for comfort, but to survive. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. But how, Marcus? How do you hold the empire together when the empire is rotting from within? How do you summon justice when your own generals eye your crown with envy? How do you remain unshaken when your own children turn soft in the face of power? You could have abdicated. No one would have blamed you. The Senate was splintered. The plague showed no mercy. Your co-emperor Lucius Verus had already died. The weight was unbearable. And yet, you didn't surrender. You looked into the face of Rome's collapse and said, then I shall hold it longer. Not because you were unafraid, but because you understood what no tyrant ever could, that real power is restraint. That real rule begins with ruling yourself. They don't teach this in schools, not the way you lived it. They speak of emperors with power, but not of those who suffered without bitterness. They quote your wisdom without knowing it was written in nights of fever, in camps where soldiers coughed blood and called out to gods who no longer answered. But you didn't curse the gods. You didn't curse fate. You made peace with what was not in your control and mastered what was. You became the immovable, not by barking orders, but by obeying your own laws first. If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. Simple? Yes, but in a world of snakes and sycophants, it was an act of rebellion. You were the storm's still center, and that's what made them fear you. Not your armies, not your legions, but your silence. Because in silence, you had something none of them did, command of self. Do you remember the plague camps, Marcus? The stench of death so thick it drowned out every prayer. Your doctors begged you to stay away, but you walked among them. You looked into the eyes of the dying. Not because you had the cure, but because you had presence. Because to you, duty was not a convenience, it was a covenant. And when your own wife fell ill and your sons grew distant and the Senate turned colder than stone, still you wrote. You wrote not to be remembered, but to remind yourself who you were. A servant, a student of pain, a guardian of principle. You taught the world that Stoicism wasn't absence of feeling. It was the victory of values over chaos. It was waking up in darkness and still choosing to act in light. Every night, when Rome burned with despair, you picked up your pen instead of your sword. You went inward, not to escape, but to prepare. Because the true battlefield, for you, was never Germania or Parthia. It was always your own mind. And you won it. Over and over and over again. Even on the day you almost gave up, you walked that line between emperor and man, between God and dust, without ever losing the thread of your soul. Because you knew something no conqueror ever learned. You do not lead through dominance. You lead through example, and your example was carved in restraint. In the biting cold of the frontier, when your generals drank to numb their fears and soldiers whispered rumors of your death, you sat alone in your tent, scribbling. Whispering truths into your own ear like a lifeline. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. That was your gospel, not a proclamation from Olympus, not thunderbolts from the sky, but the quiet, brutal discipline of living what you preached when no one was watching and everything was crumbling. They will speak of your campaigns, Marcus, of your strategies, of your victories. But they will forget the harder battle, the invisible one, the battle to remain human. You had the right to cruelty, the power to crush opposition. But you chose mercy, again, and again, and again. Not because it was safe, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Because the man who chooses vengeance becomes what he hates. And you refused to become your enemy. Even when the Senate mocked your philosophy. Even when your generals urged you to execute dissenters. Even when your own son Commodus spat on everything you stood for, you clenched your jaw, not your fists. Because your greatest conquest wasn't land. It was yourself. They say you were weak. They say you let too much slide. But the truth? You were stronger than any tyrant Rome had ever known. Because you could have taken everything. And you chose to give. You gave them order when chaos was profitable. You gave them wisdom when ignorance was easier. You gave them service when you owed them nothing. You sat on a throne of blood and fire and ruled with principle. And when the plague decimated a third of the population, when the priests abandoned their temples and the citizens lit torches of despair, you stood before them, not with superstition, but with truth. Do not waste what remains of your life in speculating about others, because the world doesn't need more gods. It needs men who remember what it means to serve without applause, to suffer without cruelty, to act without expectation. That's who you were. Not a marble statue in a hall of myths, but a man of torn robes and sleepless nights, of cracked knuckles and unspoken grief, of silent tears and unwritten dreams. You knew what few rulers ever grasped, that the moment you forget your inner throne, your soul, every outer crown begins to rot. You didn't live for praise. You lived for alignment, for the sacred geometry between belief and behavior, for the relentless honesty of action. You didn't fear death. You feared hypocrisy. You didn't run from suffering. You ran toward it so that others wouldn't have to face it alone. You let Rome see what leadership really looks like, not in triumph but in torment, not in conquest but in compassion. Not in marble statues, but in the stillness of a man writing by candlelight, asking no one for help and giving everyone a reason to keep going. Even now, across centuries, we hear you. Not as a god, not as a king, but as a man whispering into time. It is not death that a man should fear, but never beginning to live. And in that whisper, Marcus, we find a map not of conquest, but of conscience, a path not paved with victory, but with virtue. And every step on it burns, but every step on it matters. You didn't have the luxury of collapse. Even when your bones ached from war, even when your heart fractured under betrayal, even when your lungs filled with the rot of the plague-ridden air, you did not fall. Not publicly. Not politically, not philosophically, because you understood something that most rulers never will. Your suffering does not exempt you from virtue. It summons it. Every time you buried a friend, every time you signed an order knowing it might cost hundreds of lives, every time you looked into the eyes of a man you had to punish, your heart broke a little more. But you never let it rot. You turned the breaking into discipline. You let pain become your compass, not your poison. You refused to numb it. You refused to run because you knew no empire can be stronger than the man who leads it. And if you fractured in the soul, Rome would follow. So you carried the pain like armor. You let it etch itself into every page of meditations because you were writing not for the world, but for that little voice inside you that still asked every night, am I still worthy of this crown? And you answered it, not with pride, but with practice. You didn't give speeches in the forum when the city panicked. You didn't hold processions to parade your power. You just showed up, quiet, composed, alive, present, and they saw you. They saw your calm. They saw your integrity. And even when they hated you, even when they cursed your name behind closed doors, they obeyed, because they knew that no man who rules himself can be ruled by fear. You once wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." And oh, how many injuries you endured. Backstabbing senators, corrupt magistrates, cowardly commanders, a son who chose indulgence over honor, a people who forgot how to pray unless they were afraid. But you stayed. Not because they deserved your endurance, but because you did. Because you knew your purpose did not require applause. It required endurance. And still, when the world gave you every excuse to become bitter, you gave it grace. When men begged you for vengeance, you gave them justice. When the skies themselves seemed to close in over Rome and its fate, you gave it hope. Not in chance, not in miracles, but in the quiet certainty of a man who knows, even if everything falls, I will not. You governed your emotions as you governed your empire, with scrutiny, with discipline, with a sacred refusal to let chaos dictate character. And you never let your enemies decide who you would become. Because you had already decided, long before the battles, long before the crown, long before the world watched you. You decided who you would be when no one else was looking. That is why you are not forgotten. That is why your words have survived longer than your victories. Because you did not just write them, you bled them. And somewhere, in the silence of your tent, just before dawn, you reminded yourself, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And with that, you rose again. Not to conquer, but to serve. Not to impress, but to endure. And that is what makes you immortal. You never asked to be emperor. You never sought the throne. You were summoned to it. And that was your burden. But instead of wearing it like a crown of gold, you wore it like a crown of thorns, an offering to the gods, to virtue, to fate. Because you understood. True greatness is not chosen. It is endured. Every day you woke with a war inside you. Not against the barbarians, not against traitors, but against yourself. Against the voice that whispered, you deserve rest. You've done enough. Let someone else carry the weight. But you knew, if not you, then who? The world had no shortage of powerful men. What it lacked was just men. Men who would bleed for truth and not bend it. Men who would suffer for duty and not sell it. Men who would choose the hard path, not because it led to glory, but because it led to goodness. And you chose it, again and again. When your army wept for home, and the winter froze the blood in their feet, you shared their hunger. You wrapped yourself in the same ragged cloaks. You didn't command from palaces. You stood with them in the mud. Because you knew, leaders eat last. You didn't lecture them on courage. You showed them. And when disease ravaged the camps, and priests abandoned their altars, and philosophers retreated to safe cities to write about suffering while avoiding it, you stayed. Not because you wanted to die, but because someone had to stand still while the world was collapsing. You became the stillness. You didn't give them hope by shouting from balconies. You gave them hope by not running. Because presence is the rarest form of leadership. And you, Marcus, were present. In every moment. Even when every part of you wanted to disappear. Even when the death toll made you sick. Even when they doubted your choices. Even when your own soul begged for silence. You wrote instead. You faced it. Not just the plague, but the darker virus, the one no physician could cure, despair. And you treated it with something stronger than medicine. You treated it with meaning. You taught your people that survival was not enough, that only dignity could carry a man through darkness. You didn't just rule a crumbling empire. You taught it how to fall with grace and how to rise with purpose. Because that was your final gift. Not a statue, not a monument, but an invisible legacy, a template for the soul. You lived like every action echoed into eternity. Because in your mind, it did. Not because of God's watching, not because of future historians, but because you were watching. And that was enough. That was everything. And in the end, when your breath grew thin and the candle beside your bed flickered for the final time, you did not fear death. Because death was never your enemy. It was your teacher. It had sat beside you your whole life, whispering every time you mourned a friend, every time you passed a beggar in the street, every time you stared into the eyes of a soldier bleeding out in your arms. It taught you what philosophers only pretend to know. That a man cannot control how long he lives, but he can control how deeply. And you lived deeply, Marcus. You loved this world, even when it didn't love you back. You served people who would never remember your name. You held the line not because you were told to, but because you couldn't imagine not holding it. And when your body finally gave out, worn, not wasted, you left behind something greater than power. You left behind principle. Because you understood. It is better to be remembered as a man of virtue than to be worshipped as a god of victory. The Senate wrote epics about your reign, but you wrote the truth. And that truth has outlived every marble statue. Because it lives in the silent battles we all face, in the morning mirror, in the tempting lie, in the easy way out. It lives in the choice to endure. And you, the emperor who almost gave up, became the one who taught the world how to stand again. Not with might, but with meaning. You whispered, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. And your soul, despite the blood, the betrayal, the burden, was never darkened. It stayed bright. It stayed just. It stayed human. And now, centuries later, when the world forgets its conscience, when people hunger for truth but drown in noise, your words return like a steady hand on the shoulder. Not screaming, not demanding, just present, just firm, just there. And so if today, you, the one hearing this, feel like you're at your limit, if your soul is tired, if the crown on your head, whether it's the crown of parenthood, leadership, service, survival, feels too heavy, remember this, you are not alone. Marcus once sat where you sit, once trembled as you tremble, once questioned as you question, but he stood. And so can you. Because greatness isn't born in certainty. It is born in the moment you whisper to yourself, I will not break today. You will endure, not because it's easy, but because it's right. And when you do, when you rise from the ashes of despair and choose integrity again and again, you carry his legacy, not as a fan, not as a student, but as a descendant, a soul who chooses the harder path, the nobler path, the Stoic path. So go, write your own meditations, stand in your own plague, hold your own line. And when you almost give up, remember, the emperor did too. And still he stood. So now, so must you.